Hey, thanks for checking out the video today. I'm Pastor Ryan Heller. I've been a church planter and pastor for the last 20 years, and I'm sharing my reflections today, my 10 greatest surprises as a church planter. I'm now engaged in my third church plant, so this is something that I've thought a lot about. If you haven't had a chance to check out the first video, go back and check the first 5 surprises out, and now I want to give you surprises 6 through 10. Okay, here's number 6. I thought preaching would grow the church more than leading. I went and enrolled in the D-Min program in preaching because I was certain that great preaching was going to grow the church. What I discovered is that great leadership grows the church, not necessarily great preaching. In fact, I know a lot of great preachers that pastor mid-sized churches, and I know guys that are okay preachers that pastor really large churches. What's the difference? Leading. Leading makes the difference. Now, preaching is extremely important. I'm super passionate about preaching. I love preaching. But leading is the number one thing that a church planter has got to be able to do. Listen, if you're a good leader, you can raise money, hire staff, solve problems, find facilities to meet in, and overcome whatever obstacles are before you as a church planter. Leading is more important than preaching when it comes to getting that church off the ground and really growing what you need to do. This was a great surprise to me. Again, I thought great preaching alone was going to really grow that church, and I was surprised. Okay, here's number 7. It took me longer to get the church established than I thought. I thought we would have a solid financial base at 5 years. In my last church, we were running 700 people a weekend. We were in our own building, a 50,000 square foot building, within 5 years. But even though we had a facility, I would still tell you that my financial base was not that solid. It really wasn't. The per person giving was not that great. The leadership base, man, it still was a struggle. And even at the 10-year mark, I don't know. It wasn't what I had hoped and anticipated. I never had as much as I had hoped. And I think some of that may depend on the region of the country that you're in. I was in Denver, Colorado, where very few people go to church. In some other cities, that might be a little bit easier. I'm not sure. But I think that in general, to get a new church solid financially, with its leadership base and its other things, it's going to take longer than what you think, Pastor. It probably will. Church planters tend to be a little bit too optimistic at times. Number 8, teaching directly on tithing and stewardship was a critical part of financial stability. I was so depressed. Our offerings were they were so terrible the first few years of the church. I remember calling a church planting friend of mine. He said, "Ryan, do you teach directly on tithing?" And I said, well, yeah. And he said, "No, I'm serious. Like, are you hinting at giving or are you teaching it directly?" And I said, "Well, if you ask it that way, I've been hinting." He said, "Well, don't be mad at the people. You've got to be more direct about giving and stewardship." When I started preaching directly on tithing and stewardship, the giving went up. In fact, every year I do a 3 to 4 week sermon series just on giving. And it has built a much more solid foundation financially for the church. It never is what I hope it to be and want it to be, but it's a lot better than it was. And especially if you're reaching a lot of unchurched people that have never given to the church before, you really do have to teach them. And if you hint around at it, I don't think that's going to work. I think we need to be very unapologetic, very direct. We should never apologize for asking people to give. You know, I've heard pastors say, "I'm so sorry, I have to preach this sermon one time a year, and I promise I'll never do it again until next year." And then nobody comes, the next week. I think it's got to be bold, unapologetic, straightforward. And if we do that, we'll have the resources that we need to grow the church. And if we don't, we're going to be stressed out and the church is going to suffer. So teaching directly on tithing and stewardship was critical. Number 9, the environment was more volatile than I anticipated. I think I said this possibly earlier. People join a church plant quicker and people leave a church plant quicker than they do an established church. If somebody's been a member for 20 years, it's harder for them to leave. If somebody's been a member for 6 months, it's easy for them to leave. And church plants are very volatile. When you're the hot church in town, everybody's coming. I've ridden that wave before. I've also ridden the wave where groups of people have gone to the church down the street and everybody's put it on Facebook. And I know what that's like too. Church planting is volatile. You can't get too high when the church is growing. You can't get too depressed when you suffer a great setback. The environment is volatile, and it's going to be that way probably for quite a while, maybe 10 years in certain situations. Here's the final thing that I've discovered, my 10th greatest surprise, okay, if you will, in church planting. Number 10, hiring and developing staff is harder than it looks. I think the hardest thing in church planting probably is finding the right leaders. It may be. I would rather raise money than hire leaders. I now use a leadership coach that helps me go through the interview process with all candidates because I've made so many mistakes. I've made the mistake of hiring the guy that's available. Like, Pastor Ryan, I haven't worked in 6 months. God wants me to work for you. I used to think, manna from heaven, God has brought me a staff person. And then I realized the reason that guy hadn't worked for 6 months was because nobody could work with him. And I was a little naive about that. I tend to be a little optimistic about staff. And so I've learned to go slower, to ask more questions, to be more critical, to bring in other voices to interview. Hey man, am I crazy? What do you think about this? And now I mentioned I have a leadership coach that's helping me, really, really ask those questions so I don't get overly excited. But I've made so many bad hires. I mean, bad hires. And I'm embarrassed at some of the hires that I've made. But I don't think it's that unusual. In fact, I was telling a pastor of a really large church not too long ago about 2 bad hires that I made. And he said, Ryan, if you've only hired 2 bad staff members, you're a lot better leader than I am. And he was very encouraging to me in that. Every pastor has hired the wrong people. That's true for all of us. But going a little slower, being a little more critical is necessary. In fact, I started calling references before I did the interview because what would happen is I would fall in love with a candidate in the interview, and then I would call the references, and the references would hint at problems, but I wouldn't hear it because I had already decided that I wanted to hire that person. And I've made mistakes doing that. So, Pastor, I hope that, church planter, I hope that some of the things I've shared with you today will help you. I want to be an encouragement. I love church planting. I might be crazy, but I am starting my 3rd church. So even though church planting has been a hard road for me, I've seen a lot of people give their lives to Christ. I still love it. My family's still committed to it. And we're back in the saddle starting this 3rd church right now. But I wanted to share with you as a 20-year veteran my 10 greatest surprises because I thought that it might help somebody that was about to plant a church or who was planting a church. God bless you, Pastor. Many more resources and videos to come. I hope you're blessed today as you watch my 10 greatest church planting surprises.